Hey guys, tonight we're exploring the fragile boundary between the mundane and the mysterious. Think about the rhythm of a normal day, the commute to work, the familiar faces, the clock on the wall ticking toward quitting time. It's a landscape of routine so predictable that we rarely notice its details. But it is in this very landscape that some of the most unsettling true crime stories are born. These are not tales of intricate conspiracies or long-hunted killers. They are stories about the moment that predictable rhythm is shattered by a single, inexplicable event. A door that closes for the last time. A routine walk that leads to an unknown destination. A person who simply fails to arrive. We are delving into cases where the mystery lies not in a grand scheme, but in a sudden, jarring fracture in the fabric of an ordinary life. These are the stories that remind us how quickly the familiar can become alien, and how a person can be present one moment and an eternal question the next. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to notice the quiet routines of your own space. The familiar weight of the blanket, the specific pattern of shadows on the wall, the low hum of the world outside settling down for the night. These are the anchors of normalcy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're ready to explore what happens when those anchors are cut loose. It helps this community grow, a global collection of curious minds seeking patterns in the chaos. And on that note, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. It's always a humbling experience to see our virtual campfire stretch across the map. Now dim the lights, get settled. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. The disappearance of Jean Spangler, Los Angeles, 1949. It was a city high on post-war optimism, a sun-drenched landscape of boundless promise. This was the tail end of Hollywood's golden age, a dream factory churning out larger-than-life fantasies for the entire world. The air was thick with the scent of orange blossoms and ambition. Aspiring actors, writers, and artists flocked to the city, drawn by the magnetic pull of the studio gates and the promise of a life lived in the glamorous glow of the Klieg lights. But beneath the shimmering facade of Hollywood, there was always a darker current, a world of back-alley deals, desperate secrets, and dreams that curdled into nightmares. It was a city that could make you a star overnight, or it could swallow you whole, leaving not even a shadow behind. It was in this city of dazzling light and deep shadow that a 26-year-old aspiring actress named Jean Spangler was about to perform her final vanishing act. Jean was, in many ways, the archetypal Hollywood hopeful. She was beautiful, with striking features and a dancer's poise. She had worked as a dancer at the Florentine Gardens and Earl Carroll's Theater, popular night spots that showcased glamorous showgirls. She had also managed to break into the movies, landing small, uncredited bit parts in films starring big names like Betty Grable and Kirk Douglas. She was just on the periphery of the world she so desperately wanted to join, always just one lucky break away from stardom. But Jean's life was more complicated than that of the average starlet. She was a single mother to a 5-year-old daughter named Christine, the result of a tumultuous marriage to a man named Dexter Benner, which had ended in a bitter divorce. She lived with her mother, Florence, her daughter, her brother, and her sister-in-law in a modest home in the Park La Brea area, a life far removed from the lavish mansions of Beverly Hills. On the evening of Friday, October 7th, 1949, Jean was getting ready to go out. She told her mother she had 2 errands to run. First, she was going to meet her ex-husband, Dexter, to discuss a late child support payment. After that, she said, she had to go to a night shoot for a new film she was working on. She kissed her daughter goodbye, told her sister-in-law, Sophie, that she would probably work the full 8 hours and be home late, and then walked out the door around 5 p.m., disappearing into the Los Angeles twilight. When Jean hadn't returned by the next morning, her mother, Florence, began to worry. This was unusual, but not entirely unprecedented in the unpredictable world of film production. Florence called the studio where Jean had previously worked, but they had no record of a night shoot. A knot of dread began to tighten. She called the police to file a missing persons report. The initial police response was lukewarm. This was Los Angeles, after all, and the disappearance of a beautiful young actress was often just a temporary story of a clandestine weekend tryst or a sudden, impulsive trip to Las Vegas. They assured the family she would likely turn up in a day or two. But Jean didn't turn up. On Sunday, October 9th, 2 days after she vanished, a store clerk found something lying in the dusty, windswept dirt near an entrance to Griffith Park, a vast and rugged expanse of urban wilderness known for its hiking trails and dark, secluded corners. It was a woman's purse. The clerk picked it up. One of the straps was broken, as if it had been forcefully torn from a shoulder. He opened it and looked inside for identification. He found a slip of paper with the name Jean Spangler. He immediately turned it over to the police. The discovery of the purse changed everything. This was no longer a case of a flighty actress. This was a potential crime scene. The police dispatched a massive search party, over 60 officers and 100 volunteers, to scour the sprawling 4,200 acres of Griffith Park. They searched for days, on foot and on horseback, combing through the thick brush and dusty canyons, but they found nothing. No body, no discarded clothing, no signs of a struggle. It was as if she had walked to the edge of the park and simply ceased to exist. The contents of the purse became the focal point of the investigation, offering a series of tantalizing and deeply confusing clues. Inside, police found her keys and a small amount of money, but it was an unfinished, handwritten note that transformed the case from a local mystery into a national sensation. The note, written in Jean's own hand, was strangely incomplete. It was addressed to a Kirk and read, "Kirk, can't wait any longer. Going to see Dr. Scott. It will work best this way while Mother is away." The note was a bombshell, a cryptic message that seemed to hint at a secret life Jean had been living. It immediately raised 3 critical questions. Who was Kirk? Who was this Dr. Scott? And what was the mysterious procedure that will work best this way while Mother is away? The Kirk connection sent the Hollywood press into a frenzy. The most famous Kirk in Hollywood at the time, and the only one Jean was known to have worked with, was the rising superstar Kirk Douglas. He had just finished filming Young Man with a Horn, a movie in which Jean had a small, uncredited role as a dancer. When reporters hounded him for a comment, Douglas, who was vacationing in Palm Springs, admitted that he remembered her vaguely as a bit player but denied having any personal relationship with her. He told police he had been in Palm Springs at the time of her disappearance. The police seemed to accept his story, and he was quickly cleared, but the shadow of his name would forever be linked to the case. The Dr. Scott part of the note led investigators down a much darker and more plausible path. In 1949, abortion was illegal, a dangerous and clandestine procedure often performed by unlicensed practitioners in back rooms, frequently with fatal consequences. The cryptic phrase, "It will work best this way," sounded like code for a secret medical procedure. Investigators scrambled to identify a Dr. Scott in the Los Angeles area. They interviewed dozens of doctors, but none had any connection to Jean. The theory suggested that perhaps Dr. Scott wasn't a real doctor at all, but a pseudonym for a back-alley abortionist. Friends of Jean later told police that she had confided in them that she was 3 months pregnant and was desperate to terminate the pregnancy, believing it would ruin her already fragile chances at a film career. This theory painted a tragic picture. Jean, desperate and alone, had sought out a dangerous, illegal procedure. The broken strap on her purse suggested a struggle. Had the procedure been botched? Had she died at the hands of an unlicensed practitioner who then disposed of her body and abandoned her purse in Griffith Park to throw off investigators? This seemed to be the most logical and heartbreaking explanation. But there were other inconsistencies that troubled the police. The story she had told her mother about meeting her ex-husband, Dexter Benner, was a lie. When questioned, Benner said he hadn't seen Jean in weeks and had no plans to meet with her. The story about the night shoot was also a lie. No studio in Hollywood had any record of her working that night. Why would she lie to her family about her plans? Was it simply to provide a cover for her secret appointment with Dr. Scott? Or was there another, even more sinister reason for her deception? The mystery of Jean Spangler was no longer just about where she had gone, but about who she truly was and what secrets she had carried with her into that fateful October night. The investigation into Jean Spangler's disappearance became a frustrating exercise in chasing ghosts. The 2 primary leads from the note, the Hollywood star Kirk Douglas and the elusive Dr. Scott, had dissolved into tantalizing but ultimately fruitless dead ends, while the press, hungry for a scandal, continued to speculate about a deeper connection to Douglas. The Los Angeles Police Department found no evidence to support it. Douglas's alibi was solid, and without further information, they had no reason to pursue him. The search for Dr. Scott was even more maddening. Investigators canvassed the city, interviewing dozens of legitimate physicians and trying to penetrate the secretive, underground network of illegal abortion providers. It was a world that thrived on anonymity, and the name Dr. Scott was likely a pseudonym chosen for its commonplaceness. A deliberate dead end. The theory of a botched abortion remained the most plausible and tragic explanation for her vanishing. But without a body or a witness, it was pure speculation. With their main avenues of inquiry exhausted, investigators were forced to widen their net, turning their attention to the other men who had populated the periphery of Jean's life. They hoped to find a new lead in the tangled web of her romantic and social relationships, a thread that might unravel the entire mystery. This was Hollywood. After all, a place where ambition, desire, and danger often walked hand in hand. One figure who came under brief but intense scrutiny was a man known only as Scotty. A former Army lieutenant Jean had been seen with. Friends described their relationship as tempestuous. Scotty was reportedly possessive and had a violent temper. He had allegedly threatened Jean on at least one occasion, telling her that if he couldn't have her, no one would. This lead seemed promising. A spurned, violent lover was a classic motive for foul play. Police tracked Scotty down and questioned him extensively. However, his attorney provided a rock-solid alibi, proving that he was nowhere near Los Angeles at the time of Jean's disappearance. He was another dead end. The investigation then veered into a darker, more dangerous territory. Jean's connections to organized crime. The Los Angeles of the 1940s was not just the city of movie stars. It was the city of Bugsy Siegel and Mickey Cohen. The line between the glamour of the studio system and the grit of the criminal underworld was surprisingly thin. Mobsters owned nightclubs, financed films, and socialized with starlets. Jean, with her work as a dancer at popular night spots, would have inevitably crossed paths with this world. Investigators learned that she was known to associate with several low-level figures connected to Mickey Cohen's powerful crime syndicate. She had been seen at parties and nightclubs frequented by mob figures, places where deals were made and secrets were currency. This connection opened up a terrifying new realm of possibilities. Had Jean overheard something she wasn't supposed to? Had she become romantically involved with a dangerous man who decided she was a liability? A mob hit would explain her sudden and complete disappearance with chilling efficiency. Organized crime syndicates were ruthlessly proficient at making bodies vanish, and the vast, desolate stretches of the Mojave Desert just outside the city were a notorious dumping ground. This theory also offered a potential explanation for the note. Perhaps Dr. Scott wasn't a doctor at all, but a code name for a mob figure, and the procedure was not a medical one, but a meeting. This line of inquiry, however, was fraught with peril for the investigators. The Cohen gang had deep roots in the city and was known for its influence and its brutality. Witnesses were terrified to come forward, and any potential leads quickly dried up in a climate of fear. The case took an even more sinister turn when a close friend of Jean's came forward with a truly explosive allegation. She told police that Jean had been involved in a brief but intense affair with a high-ranking officer in the Los Angeles Police Department. She described the man as powerful and brutal. According to the friend, the officer had become obsessive, and he had threatened Jean when she tried to end the relationship. This allegation cast a chilling pall over the entire investigation. If a powerful member of the LAPD was involved, it would explain why the case seemed to be hitting so many brick walls. It suggested the possibility of a deliberate cover-up from within the very organization tasked with finding her. An officer of the law would have the knowledge and the means to commit a crime and effectively erase the evidence. This lead was almost too dangerous to pursue openly. It was investigated quietly, internally, but like so many other threads, it seemingly vanished into the ether, never to be spoken of publicly again. As the weeks turned into months and then years, the case grew colder. Jean Spangler's face, once a symbol of Hollywood hope, was now a haunting reminder of one of the city's most enduring and tragic mysteries. The story took another bizarre turn in 1950, when customs officials in El Paso, Texas, reported a possible sighting. A hotel employee and a local attorney both claimed to have seen a woman who looked exactly like Jean. She was in the company of a well-known mob associate named Davy Ogle, a man who himself had recently gone missing under a federal indictment. This led to a new wave of speculation that Jean had willingly run away with the mobster, perhaps to escape the pregnancy or other troubles in Los Angeles. The idea of her starting a new life in Mexico was a tantalizing one, offering a less tragic conclusion than murder. But the sighting was never definitively confirmed. It was another phantom glimpse in a case full of them, a story that could have been a case of mistaken identity or a deliberate piece of misdirection planted by the mob. The disappearance had a devastating impact on Jean's family. Her mother, Florence, held out hope for years, convinced that her daughter would one day walk through the door. Her 5-year-old daughter, Christine, went to live with her father, Dexter Benner. She grew up under the shadow of her mother's mysterious vanishing, a permanent question mark at the center of her life. The case officially remains open with the LAPD to this day, one of the oldest active missing persons files on their books. It has become a piece of dark Hollywood folklore, often mentioned in the same breath as the infamous Black Dahlia murder, which had occurred just 2 years prior. Both cases involved beautiful young women with Hollywood aspirations whose lives ended in a brutal, unsolved mystery, forever linking them in the city's tragic mythology. Over the decades, armchair detectives and historians have continued to dissect the few clues left behind, searching for a unifying theory that makes sense of the contradictions. The most enduring theory remains that of a botched illegal abortion. It is the simplest explanation and aligns with the most concrete evidence. The note found in her purse and the testimony of her friends that she was pregnant and desperate. In this scenario, the lies she told her family were simply a cover story to protect her secret. The broken purse strap could be the result of a struggle if the procedure went wrong, or it could have been torn as her body was being moved. The abandonment of the purse in Griffith Park could have been a deliberate attempt to mislead police, to make it look like a random street crime rather than a medical procedure gone wrong. But the loose ends continue to nag. If Kirk Douglas was not involved, why did she write his name? Was it a simple case of celebrity obsession, a fantasy she was living out in her private notes? Or was Kirk a nickname for someone else entirely? And what of her ex-husband, Dexter Benner? While he was quickly cleared, his relationship with Jean had been notoriously volatile. They had fought a bitter custody battle over their daughter, and some have speculated that he may have had a motive to see her disappear. However, no evidence ever surfaced to connect him to the crime. Ultimately, the story of Jean Spangler is a tragic tapestry woven from the threads of ambition, secrecy, and the dangerous realities that lurked beneath the glamour of post-war Hollywood. She was a young woman juggling the immense pressures of single motherhood with the fierce, competitive drive to make a name for herself in an industry known for exploiting young women. She was navigating a world where powerful men, producers, mobsters, and perhaps even police officers, held immense sway over the lives and careers of aspiring starlets. She was forced to make impossible choices in a society that offered few protections for a woman in her position. Her disappearance is a stark reminder of the dark side of the Hollywood dream. It's a story about a life that was paused mid-sentence, leaving behind only a few cryptic words in a purse and a void that has never been filled. Jean Spangler walked out of her home into the California twilight and into a mystery that has now endured for over 70 years. Her case file remains open, a silent testament to a life that vanished, and a chilling example of how, in the city of dreams, a nightmare can be waiting just around the corner. The light from the Hollywood sign may shine bright, but the shadows it casts are long and deep, and some of them hold secrets that will never be brought to light. The Tylenol murders, the tragic, unsolved story of Jean Spangler, is a mystery born of secrets and lies, a private tragedy that played out against the glamorous backdrop of Hollywood. But some cases are not confined to a single life or a single city. They erupt into the public consciousness with such force that they change the fabric of society itself. They are stories that begin not with a person, but with a product, an everyday item so familiar and so trusted that it sits in nearly every medicine cabinet in the country. This is the story of a crime that transformed an act of healing into an act of terror, a series of poisonings that held a nation captive and forever changed the way we think about the safety of the things we consume. This is the story of the Chicago Tylenol murders. The autumn of 1982 began like any other in the sprawling suburbs of Chicago. It was a time of falling leaves, crisp air, and kids heading back to school. In households across the region, families went about their daily routines, stocking their pantries and medicine cabinets with trusted brand-name products. And in 1982, few brands were more trusted than Tylenol. Manufactured by McNeil Consumer Products, a subsidiary of the corporate giant Johnson & Johnson, extra-strength Tylenol was the best-selling, non-prescription pain reliever in the United States. It was a household name synonymous with safe, effective relief for headaches, aches, and pains. The iconic red and white capsules were a familiar sight, a go-to remedy for millions of Americans. This absolute trust was about to be shattered in the most horrific way imaginable. The nightmare began on the morning of Wednesday, September 29th, in the quiet suburb of Elk Grove Village. 12-year-old Mary Kellerman woke up with a sore throat and a runny nose, the first signs of a common cold. Her parents, seeking to ease her discomfort, gave her a single extra-strength Tylenol capsule from a brand-new bottle they had just purchased. Moments later, Mary collapsed on the bathroom floor. Her parents called for an ambulance, and paramedics rushed her to the hospital. But it was too late. She was pronounced dead shortly after arriving. The doctors were baffled. A healthy 12-year-old girl does not simply drop dead from a cold. Her death was a tragic and inexplicable anomaly. At the time, no one had any reason to suspect the Tylenol capsule she had just swallowed. Just a few hours later, in the nearby town of Arlington Heights, the tragedy repeated itself. A 27-year-old postal worker named Adam Janis was at home, feeling a dull ache. He took 1 or 2 Tylenol capsules from a bottle in his medicine cabinet. Within a short time, he collapsed and was rushed to the hospital, where he too died suddenly. His family, shocked and grief-stricken, gathered at his home to make funeral arrangements. Overcome with stress and headaches, Adam's younger brother, 25-year-old Stanley Janis, and his 19-year-old wife, Teresa, reached for the same bottle of Tylenol that Adam had used. They each took a capsule. Within minutes, Stanley collapsed. Soon after, Teresa fell to the floor. Both were rushed to the same hospital where Adam had just died. Stanley died that same day. Teresa clung to life for 2 more days before she, too, succumbed. 3 members of the same family were now dead, all within 48 hours, all from sudden, unexplained cardiac arrest. The situation was so bizarre and so alarming that it triggered an immediate public health investigation. 2 vigilant off-duty firefighters, Philip Capitelli and Richard Keyworth, were discussing the strange cluster of deaths. They noted the one common thread. The victims had all taken Tylenol just before collapsing. It was a long shot, a seemingly impossible connection, but they decided to raise the alarm. They contacted Helen Jensen, a public health nurse in Arlington Heights. Jensen, in turn, called her boss, who contacted the county medical examiner's office. The medical examiner had just received the initial toxicology reports from Mary Kellerman's death. The reports revealed a shocking and terrifying cause. She had died from acute cyanide poisoning. Suddenly, the impossible connection became a horrifying reality. The puzzle pieces began to click into place with terrifying speed. The medical examiner ordered toxicology tests on the Janis family victims. The results came back the same: massive, fatal doses of potassium cyanide. The common link was undeniable. The Tylenol capsules themselves were the murder weapon. The news spread like a shockwave through the Chicago area. That same day, another death was linked to the poison medication. In Winfield, a 27-year-old new mother named Mary Reiner, who had recently given birth, took a Tylenol for post-delivery pain. She collapsed and died. In the Chicago suburb of Lombard, a 35-year-old woman named Mary McFarland also died after taking a capsule from a contaminated bottle. And in Chicago itself, A 35-year-old United Airlines flight attendant named Paula Prince was found dead in her apartment. An open bottle of poison Tylenol was on her bathroom counter. In the span of just a few days, 7 people were dead. They were all from different towns, they had no connection to one another, and they had all purchased their Tylenol from different stores. The only thing they had in common was their choice of pain reliever. A wave of panic, unlike anything the country had ever seen, began to spread. This was a new and insidious form of terrorism. It wasn't a bomb or a gunman. It was a silent, invisible killer lurking in the most trusted corner of the home. The killer had weaponized the very concept of consumer trust. Johnson & Johnson and local authorities immediately sprang into action. A massive public health alert was issued. Police cars drove through Chicago neighborhoods, using loudspeakers to warn residents not to take Tylenol under any circumstances. Television and radio broadcasts carried urgent warnings. The nation watched in horror as the story unfolded. Investigators quickly determined that the tampering had not occurred at the manufacturing plant. The poison bottles came from different factories and different production lots. The chilling conclusion was that the killer or killers had purchased the bottles from various drugstores and supermarkets in the Chicago area, taken them home, carefully opened the capsules, replaced some of the acetaminophen powder with deadly cyanide, and then skillfully returned the bottles to the store shelves to be sold to unsuspecting customers. The scale of the recall was unprecedented. Johnson & Johnson, in a move that would become a case study in corporate responsibility, immediately recalled all 31 million bottles of Tylenol currently in circulation across the United States, a decision that cost the company over $100 million. They offered to replace every single bottle with a new, safer product free of charge. Their swift and decisive action was widely praised and is credited with saving countless lives. While the public health crisis was being managed, a massive criminal investigation was launched. A multi-jurisdictional task force, including local police, the Illinois State Police, and the FBI, was formed to hunt for the person who would become known as the Tylenol killer. The crime was terrifying in its randomness and its anonymity. The victims were not targeted individuals. They were random casualties in a depraved act of mass murder. The killer had no personal connection to them. Their only motive seemed to be to create widespread terror and chaos. The investigation was a logistical nightmare. The poison bottles had been purchased from at least 6 different stores, including a Jewel grocery store and several Osco drugstores. Investigators had to treat each location as a separate crime scene, interviewing employees and searching for any unusual activity. They analyzed the cyanide used, a common but controlled substance, hoping to trace its origin. They examined the returned bottles for fingerprints, but the killer had been careful. The investigation was a massive undertaking, but it was yielding very few leads. The killer was a ghost, a phantom who had slipped into the mundane world of retail commerce, planted their deadly traps, and vanished without a trace. The city of Chicago, and the entire nation, waited in fear, wondering when and where the invisible killer might strike next. The hunt for the Tylenol killer became one of the most intense and high-pressure manhunts in American history. The crime itself was a terrifying new breed of domestic terrorism, one that targeted the fundamental trust between consumers and the products on which they relied. The killer was not just a murderer. They were a saboteur of the American way of life, and the multi-jurisdictional task force, comprising hundreds of local, state, and federal officers, felt the immense weight of a nation demanding answers. The investigation fanned out in a dozen different directions. A frantic search for a ghost who had left behind 7 bodies, but very few clues. One of the first and most critical tasks was to analyze the poison itself. The potassium cyanide used was a commercial-grade substance, but tracing its specific source proved to be an impossible task. Cyanide was used in a wide range of industrial processes, from gold mining to electroplating to photography, making it difficult to pinpoint a single point of origin. Investigators also meticulously examined the tampered capsules. The killer had been disturbingly skilled. They had managed to open the gelatin capsules, replace the acetaminophen powder with the crystalline cyanide, and then carefully reassemble them, leaving little to no visible sign of tampering. This suggested a certain level of patience, dexterity, and perhaps even some familiarity with handling such materials, but it did not provide a definitive profile. With little physical evidence to go on, the task force turned its attention to potential suspects, and a few individuals quickly rose to the top of the list. The first was a disgruntled employee at one of the manufacturing plants or a warehouse. This theory was attractive because it offered a clear motive: revenge against the company. However, investigators soon ruled it out. The poison bottles came from different production lots, manufactured in different plants, one in Pennsylvania and one in Texas. For a single employee at one location to have access to both lots would have been nearly impossible. Furthermore, the tampering clearly occurred after the products had reached the Chicago area. The focus then shifted to individuals in the Chicago region. A man named Roger Arnold, a dock worker at a local Jewel supermarket warehouse, came under scrutiny after he told bar patrons that he possessed cyanide and mused about how easy it would be to poison the city. His ex-wife later reported him to the police. While he had a background in chemistry from his college days, investigators could find no concrete evidence linking him to the actual poisonings. He was a person of interest, but the case against him was purely circumstantial. The investigation took a dramatic and bizarre turn with the emergence of a prime suspect who inserted himself directly into the case. James William Lewis. A few days after the poisonings, Johnson & Johnson received an extortion letter. The author demanded $1 million to stop the killing. The letter was a rambling, taunting missive, and it was traced back to James Lewis and his wife, Leanne. Lewis was a deeply troubled and intelligent man with a history of erratic behavior and a laundry list of prior offenses, including a dismemberment murder in Kansas City for which he had been charged but never convicted due to a legal technicality. He was a known tax protester and a suspected con artist. The FBI launched a massive nationwide manhunt for Lewis and his wife. They were eventually located in New York City after a librarian recognized them from a wanted poster and alerted the authorities. Under interrogation, Lewis admitted to writing the extortion letter, but he vehemently denied being the Tylenol killer. He claimed his motive was simply to embarrass his wife's former employer, with whom he had a grudge, by drawing suspicion onto them. He presented himself as a cunning opportunist who had seen the chaos of the Tylenol crisis and decided to exploit it for his own gain. Investigators were deeply suspicious. Lewis seemed to be the perfect fit. He was intelligent, manipulative, had a history of violence, and had directly involved himself in the case. They subjected him to intense questioning and scrutinized every detail of his life. They even discovered that he and his wife had lived in Chicago just before moving to New York. However, they could never find a single piece of physical evidence to tie him to the actual tampering. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses who saw him buying or returning the Tylenol, and no link to the cyanide used. Lewis provided investigators with a detailed, hypothetical account of how the killer could have committed the crime, a move that some saw as a veiled confession and others saw as the intellectual game-playing of a narcissist. Ultimately, prosecutors felt they did not have enough evidence to charge him with the murders. He was, however, convicted of extortion for sending the letter and was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, of which he served 13. To this day, many investigators believe that James Lewis was the Tylenol killer, but the case against him remains unproven. While the Lewis investigation was unfolding, another, more tragic figure emerged. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, a 36-year-old woman named Lori Dan began making harassing and threatening phone calls related to the Tylenol case. Years later, in 1988, Dan would commit a horrific crime of her own. Suffering from severe mental illness, she went on a violent rampage, attempting to mail poison and bombs to former acquaintances before entering a second-grade classroom in Winnetka, Illinois, and opening fire, killing one child and wounding several others before taking her own life. In the investigation that followed her rampage, police found evidence that she had owned cyanide. This raised the chilling possibility that she could have been the Tylenol killer. Her 1982 actions, an early, anonymous expression of the homicidal rage that would fully erupt 6 years later. However, like with Lewis, there was no direct evidence to connect her to the original poisonings. She remains a tantalizing but speculative suspect. As the criminal investigation churned on with no definitive resolution, the societal impact of the Tylenol murders was becoming clear. The crime had sent a seismic shock through the American consumer landscape. The trust that people had in the safety of over-the-counter products was shattered. The open shelf system, where anyone could pick up a product, take it home, and return it, was now seen as a terrifying vulnerability. The fear was palpable. For a time, Halloween was practically canceled in many communities, as parents were terrified that their children's candy could be tampered with. In response to this crisis, the entire packaging industry was forced to reinvent itself. Johnson & Johnson led the way, reintroducing Tylenol just 2 months after the recall, but this time in a revolutionary new tamper-proof package. The new bottles featured a triple seal system: a glued box, a plastic seal over the neck of the bottle, and a foil seal over the mouth. This multi-layered defense was designed to make any tampering immediately obvious to the consumer. The new packaging was a massive success and quickly became the industry standard. Within a year, Tylenol had regained nearly all of its market share, a testament to the company's responsible handling of the crisis. The federal government also responded swiftly, passing what became known as the Tylenol Bill, making malicious tampering with consumer products a federal crime. The tamper-evident seals that are now ubiquitous on everything from milk cartons to pill bottles are a direct legacy of the 1982 tragedy. Our modern world of sealed, protected consumer goods was born from the terror of those few days in Chicago. Despite these positive changes, the central mystery remained unsolved. The case was officially reopened in 2009. The FBI, armed with new advances in DNA technology, decided to retest the original evidence. They hoped to find trace DNA on the bottles or capsules that could finally point to a suspect. They once again focused their attention on James Lewis, searching his home and obtaining a DNA sample from him. Lewis, now in his 70s, continued to deny any involvement, even offering to cooperate fully with the investigation to clear his name. In 2023, James Lewis died of natural causes at the age of 76, taking whatever secrets he held to the grave. To date, the renewed investigation has not yielded any public results or led to any new charges. The Tylenol murders of 1982 remain one of the most chilling and impactful unsolved crimes in American history. It was a crime that was both intimate and epic in its scope. It brought tragedy directly into the homes of 7 innocent families, while simultaneously holding an entire nation hostage to fear. The killer or killers achieved a terrifying level of anonymity, committing a mass murder that was as impersonal as a lightning strike. Was it the work of a cunning extortionist like James Lewis? A disturbed individual like Lori Dan? A disgruntled employee? Or someone who was never even on the radar? A person who committed the perfect, anonymous crime and simply faded back into the crowd? The legacy of the Tylenol killer is a dual one. It is a story of profound tragedy and loss for the Kellerman, Janice, Reiner, McFarland, and Prince families. But it is also a story of resilience and positive change, a catalyst that forced an entire industry to prioritize public safety in a way it never had before. The tamper-proof seals on our medicine bottles are a silent, daily reminder of the 7 lives that were lost, and of the invisible killer who, for over 40 years, has remained a ghost in the machine of modern life. The YOGTZE case, the Tylenol case, is a story of a visible, tangible product being turned into a weapon, a mystery that played out in the bright, public light of a national panic. But some of the most unsettling cases are not about public terror, but about a deeply private one. They are mysteries that begin not with a bang, but with a crack in the fragile surface of a human mind. This is a story about a descent into paranoia so profound and so strange that it ended in a death that defies all logical explanation, leaving behind only a single, nonsensical word as its epitaph. This is the bizarre and deeply chilling case of Gunther Stoll. West Germany, in the autumn of 1984, was a nation of order and industry. It was a place where logic and efficiency were cultural cornerstones. In the small town of Anshausen, Gunther Stoll, an unemployed food engineer, was a man whose life was becoming increasingly unmoored from this sense of order. Stoll had been suffering from bouts of severe paranoia for some time. He had become convinced that he was the target of a mysterious and malevolent conspiracy. He spoke frequently to his wife, and to anyone who would listen, about them. A shadowy, unnamed group of people who were actively trying to harm him. He couldn't articulate who they were or what they wanted, but the fear was real and consuming. To his family, it was the tragic manifestation of a psychological illness, a private struggle they were trying to help him navigate. On the evening of October 25, 1984, that private struggle erupted into a terrifying and fatal sequence of events. Stoll was at home with his wife, sitting in his favorite armchair. He seemed agitated, more so than usual. Suddenly, without any warning, he leaped to his feet and cried out, "Jetzt get mir ein Licht auf," a German exclamation that translates to, "Now I get it," or more literally, "Now a light goes on for me." It was as if he had just experienced a profound and terrifying moment of revelation, as if all the scattered pieces of his paranoia had suddenly clicked into a clear and horrifying picture. He grabbed a piece of paper and a pen. With a sense of frantic urgency, he scribbled 6 letters. YOGTZE. He stared at the nonsensical word for a moment, and then, just as quickly as he had written it, he crossed it out. He offered no explanation to his bewildered wife. The meaning of YOGTZE, if it ever had one, was locked inside his fracturing mind. He then declared that he had to leave, that he needed to go to his favorite pub in the neighboring town of Wilmsdorf. He put on his coat and abruptly left the house around 11 p.m., stepping out into the cold German night. Stoll drove his Volkswagen Golf to the pub, a place where he was a well-known regular. When he arrived, he ordered a single beer, but he didn't drink it. He stood by the bar, looking pale and distressed. Then, without warning, he collapsed onto the floor. Witnesses at the pub said he hadn't been physically attacked or threatened. He simply fell. As patrons rushed to help him, he regained consciousness, but he seemed disoriented and was bleeding from his mouth, having apparently injured himself in the fall. He mumbled to the concerned onlookers, not about his fall, but about the nameless terror that had been haunting him. He spoke of a horrible incident that was about to happen that night. Before anyone could question him further, he got to his feet and quickly left the pub, leaving his untouched beer sitting on the bar. His journey from that point on becomes a series of fragmented and increasingly bizarre encounters. He did not go home. Instead, he drove to his childhood hometown of Hagerseelbach, a place about 10 kilometers away. Around 1 a.m., he knocked on the door of a woman he had known since childhood. The woman, roused from her sleep, was startled to see him on her doorstep in the middle of the night, looking disheveled and frightened. He spoke to her with a desperate urgency, again mentioning a horrible incident that was about to occur. He spoke of 4 men who were with him, though she saw no one else. "They are not my friends," he reportedly told her. His words were paranoid and rambling, and the woman, concerned for her own safety and believing he was having a severe psychological episode, refused to let him in. She advised him to go home to his wife and get some rest. Dejected, Gunther Stoll turned away from her door and walked back to his car, disappearing once more into the darkness. This would be the last time anyone who knew him would ever see him alive. Just 2 hours later, around 3 a.m., 2 truck drivers were traveling along the A45 Autobahn, a major highway near the town of Hagen, about 100 kilometers north of where Stoll had last been seen. As they drove, their headlights illuminated a strange scene on the side of the road. A white Volkswagen Golf was crashed in a ditch. It was Gunther Stoll's car. Concerned, the 2 drivers pulled over to help. What they found inside the vehicle was far stranger and more horrific than a simple car accident. Inside the crashed car was Gunther Stoll. He was completely naked. He was conscious, but barely. He was moaning in pain. The truck drivers immediately called for the police and an ambulance. As they waited, they tried to speak to him. Stoll was able to utter a few final cryptic words. He told them that there had been 4 other men in the car with him, but they had run away. He confirmed again that they were not his friends. Soon after, he lost consciousness. Paramedics arrived and rushed him to the hospital, but it was too late. Gunther Stoll died in the ambulance on the way. The initial police assessment was that this was a tragic but straightforward case. A man suffering a paranoid breakdown had driven erratically, crashed his car, and died from his injuries. But as the investigation began, that simple narrative completely unraveled, revealing a set of circumstances so contradictory and so physically impossible that it has baffled German police for decades. The first shocking discovery came from the autopsy. While Stoll had sustained injuries, they were not consistent with the minor damage to his car. The crash had been a low-speed event, essentially rolling into a ditch. His injuries, however, were severe. They were the kind of injuries one would sustain from being hit by a car, not from being inside one during a minor crash. The medical examiner concluded, stunningly, that Gunther Stoll had been run over by a different car at a different location. The second impossibility was the state of his clothes. His jacket and pants were found inside the car, but they were not on him. He had been naked when he was found, and police determined that he had likely been naked at the time he sustained his injuries. The evidence began to paint an impossible picture. Stoll, in the throes of a paranoid episode, had somehow ended up at a location far from where he was last seen. There, he had been stripped naked and then deliberately run over by a vehicle. After this, his assailants had then placed his naked, dying body back into the driver's seat of his own Volkswagen Golf, driven it to the A45 Autobahn, and staged a minor crash by pushing it into the ditch. Suddenly, Gunther Stoll's paranoid ramblings about them and the Furmen, who were not his friends, didn't sound so delusional anymore. They sounded like the literal truth. The case had transformed from a psychological tragedy into a bizarre and brutal homicide. But the questions were staggering. Who were the four men? Where did the initial assault take place? And why would anyone perpetrate such a strange and ritualistic-seeming crime? The investigation had a victim and a cause of death, but the motive and the means were shrouded in a fog as thick as Stoll's own paranoia. And at the center of it all was that one, meaningless, crossed-out word. YOGTZ. It was the only clue he had left behind. A final, nonsensical dispatch from a night that had begun with a terrifying moment of clarity and ended in an unsolvable darkness. The bizarre and brutal death of Gunther Stoll presented German investigators with a puzzle that seemed to have no logical solution. The official cause of death was clear. He had died from severe injuries sustained after being run over by a car. The manner of death was also clear. It was a homicide, but every other aspect of the case, the who, the where, the when, and most profoundly, the why, was shrouded in an impenetrable layer of high strangeness. The task force assigned to the case found themselves grappling with a set of facts that seemed to belong more to a surrealist film than a police report. The first major challenge was establishing a timeline. There was a critical 2-hour window of unaccounted for time between 1 a.m., when Stoll was last seen alive at his childhood friend's doorstep in Hager-Seelbach, and 3 a.m., when his crashed car was discovered by the truck drivers on the A45 Autobahn, 100 kilometers to the north. What happened in those 2 hours was the key to the entire mystery. It seemed physically impossible for Stoll in his own car to have driven that distance, met with assailants, been stripped naked, run over, placed back in his car, and then have the crash staged, all within that time frame. This led investigators to believe that Stoll must have met his attackers very soon after leaving his friend's house. The police theorized that Stoll did not drive his own car to the location of the final crash. Instead, they believe he was abducted or willingly went with his assailants in their vehicle to an unknown location. It was at this primary crime scene that he was assaulted and run over. His attackers then used his own Volkswagen Golf to transport his dying body to the Autobahn to stage the accident. This would explain the timeline, but it opened up a host of new questions. Where was this primary location? And how did the killers manage to orchestrate such a complex series of events without leaving a single trace? The investigation turned to the people who may have seen something that night. Police issued a public appeal for witnesses. One key witness did come forward. A hitchhiker who claimed to have seen a white Volkswagen Golf parked near the Hagensud Autobahn exit shortly before the crash was discovered. The hitchhiker reported seeing a man in a light-colored jacket walking near the car. This could have been one of the assailants, but the description was too vague to be of any real use, and the witness could not provide a license plate number. The lead went nowhere. With the physical investigation stalled, police turned their attention to the cryptic centerpiece of the case. The note with the letters YOGTZE. It was the only tangible clue Gunther Stoll had left behind, a message scribbled in a moment of frantic insight. Investigators were convinced that if they could decipher its meaning, it might unlock the entire case. They pursued every possible avenue. Was it an acronym? An anagram? A license plate number? A code? They explored the possibility that it was a ham radio call sign. Stoll was not a licensed ham radio operator, but perhaps he had overheard something. They cross-referenced the letters with databases of German and international call signs, but found no match. The closest was a Romanian call sign, YOGTZE, but investigations into this lead proved fruitless. There was no connection between Stoll and anyone in Romania. They considered that it might be a license plate, but the letter combination YOG is not used on German plates. They looked at foreign plates, but again, found no logical connection. The idea that it was an anagram was also explored, but the letters do not easily rearrange into any coherent German word. The note was a complete enigma. The fact that Stoll had immediately crossed it out after writing it only added to the mystery. Did he realize he had made a mistake? Or did he realize that writing it down was too dangerous? The police were forced to consider a more psychological explanation. Given Stoll's documented paranoia, it was highly probable that YOGTZE had no external, objective meaning at all. It could have been a neologism, a word created by his own distressed mind, a symbol for the nameless, formless threat that he believed was pursuing him. In this interpretation, the note was not a clue to a crime, but a symptom of the illness that may have led him into a dangerous situation. Perhaps his paranoia had caused him to confront the wrong people, or to wander into a situation that turned violent. It's possible his death was not the result of a sophisticated conspiracy, but a tragic, random act of violence that he had, in a way, stumbled into because of his mental state. This theory, however, still could not explain the bizarrely specific and seemingly ritualistic nature of the crime. Why strip him naked? Why run him over? Why go to the immense trouble of placing him back in his car and staging a crash 100 kilometers away? A random act of violence is usually quick and brutal. This felt orchestrated, deliberate, and deeply strange. Over the years, the YOGTZE case has become a legendary unsolved mystery in Germany, a staple of true crime forums and late-night discussions. The lack of answers has allowed for more outlandish theories to take root. Some have suggested that Stoll was involved in some form of espionage or corporate intrigue, given his background as a food engineer. Perhaps he had uncovered a secret about a company or a product, and YOGTZE was a code related to it. Others have pointed to the possibility of a cult or a secret society, suggesting the crime had a ritualistic purpose that is incomprehensible to outsiders. The case remains officially open but inactive. The 4 men Stoll claimed were with him have never been identified. The primary crime scene has never been located. The 2-hour gap in the timeline remains a black hole of information, and the meaning of YOGTZE remains a complete mystery. The death of Gunther Stoll is a chilling intersection of true crime and the uncanny. It's a story where the victim's own perception of reality was warped, making it impossible to distinguish between a paranoid delusion and a genuine, mortal threat. Was he a man whose mental illness led him to a tragic, random end? Or was he a man who, in a terrifying moment of clarity, finally understood the nature of a very real conspiracy against him, only to be silenced before he could share it? The truth seems to lie in an unknowable space between the two. The only certainty is that on a cold October night, a man scribbled a nonsensical word, crossed it out, and walked out into the darkness to meet a fate so bizarre and so inexplicable that it continues to haunt investigators and armchair detectives to this day. The case is a perfect, unsolvable loop, beginning and ending with a single, cryptic word that serves as a permanent monument to an absolute mystery. The death of Gloria Ramirez, the YOGTZE case, is a journey into the labyrinth of a single, paranoid mind, where the line between an internal struggle and an external threat is impossibly blurred. But what happens when that blur extends beyond one person? When a medical mystery becomes so strange and so dangerous that it seems to defy the very laws of science? This is a story that begins not with a crime, but with a medical emergency. It unfolds under the bright, sterile lights of a hospital, a place of science and reason. But on one February night, that reason would be stretched to its breaking point, leaving behind a trail of sickened medical staff, a quarantine, a hazmat team, and a central victim who would become known to the world as the Toxic Lady. This is the baffling and deeply unsettling case of Gloria Ramirez. The evening of February 19th, 1994, was a busy one in the emergency room of General Hospital in Riverside, California. The staff was accustomed to the controlled chaos of a Saturday night, dealing with a constant flow of injuries and illnesses. Around 8:15 p.m., paramedics wheeled in a patient in acute distress. She was a 31-year-old woman named Gloria Ramirez. She was conscious but disoriented. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and her heart was beating at a dangerously high rate. The paramedics reported that she was suffering from late-stage cervical cancer and was complaining of severe heart palpitations. The ER team, led by Dr. Julie Gurchinsky, immediately sprang into action, beginning the familiar, urgent rhythm of emergency care. They moved her into a trauma room and began standard procedure. They administered Valium, Versed, and Ativan to sedate her and tried to defibrillate her heart to correct its erratic rhythm. But nothing was working. Her condition was deteriorating rapidly. As they worked, the medical staff began to notice a series of strange and increasingly alarming phenomena. The first oddity was a strange, oily sheen that seemed to cover Ramirez's skin. It was unusual but not unheard of. Then, as a nurse drew blood from her arm, several staff members noticed a distinct, ammonia-like odor coming from the blood tube. This was highly irregular. A medical resident, also named Julie, took the syringe of blood. She looked at it and saw something she had never seen before. Small, manila-colored particles floating in the dark, reddish plasma. It looked like the blood contained tiny crystals. It was at this moment that the situation escalated from a difficult medical case to a full-blown hazardous event. As the medical staff leaned in to get a closer look at the strange blood sample, they began to fall ill one by one in a bizarre chain reaction. The first to collapse was the registered nurse, Susan Kane, who had drawn the blood. She complained of a burning sensation on her face, then fainted and had to be wheeled out of the room. A few moments later, Dr. Gurchinsky, the resident in charge, began to feel lightheaded. She left the trauma room and collapsed at the nurse's station, complaining of nausea and experiencing episodes of apnea, where she would stop breathing. Next, the respiratory therapist, Maureen Welch, who had been assisting with Ramirez's breathing, passed out. Chaos erupted in the emergency room. A mysterious, invisible contagion seemed to be spreading from Trauma Room 1. The hospital staff, realizing they were dealing with a potential toxic exposure, declared an internal emergency. They immediately ordered the evacuation of the entire emergency department. All patients were moved to the parking lot, where a makeshift triage center was set up. A small team of doctors and nurses, wearing protective isolation suits, remained behind to continue working on Gloria Ramirez. Despite their efforts, her heart failed completely. At 8:50 p.m., less than 45 minutes after she had arrived, Gloria Ramirez was pronounced dead. By the end of the night, a total of 23 of the 37 emergency room staff members had experienced at least one symptom, ranging from dizziness and nausea to shortness of breath and fainting. 5 of them were hospitalized. Dr. Gurchinsky was the most severely affected. She was admitted to the intensive care unit, where she developed hepatitis, pancreatitis, and avascular necrosis, a serious condition where bone tissue dies due to a lack of blood supply, which would require her to use crutches for months. The hospital was now facing an unprecedented crisis. What had happened in that trauma room? What could have possibly emanated from the body of Gloria Ramirez that was so potent it could fell an entire team of medical professionals? The Riverside County Health Department was called in, and they, in turn, called in a hazardous materials hazmat team. Dressed in fully enclosed, self-contained suits, the hazmat team entered the sealed ER. They took air samples and carefully examined the room, but found no traces of any known toxic gases like hydrogen sulfide or phosgene. The source of the mysterious illness was not in the room itself. It seemed to have come directly from Ramirez's body. The mystery deepened when investigators began to look into Gloria Ramirez's background. They learned she was a mother of two who had been battling advanced cervical cancer. In the weeks leading up to her death, she had been experiencing significant pain and had been taking a variety of medications, including painkillers and anti-nausea drugs. This led to the first major theory, that a strange combination of medications had created a toxic chemical reaction inside her body. But no combination of her prescribed drugs could explain the symptoms experienced by the ER staff. The next focus was on her cancer itself. Could a rapidly metastasizing tumor produce some kind of unknown toxic biochemical? It was a possibility, but one that had never been documented in medical literature. The case was a complete scientific anomaly. The autopsy became the critical next step. The county coroner's office, taking extreme precautions, assembled a special team to perform the examination. The pathologists worked in a sealed chamber, wearing airtight suits with their own air supply, like astronauts exploring a hostile planet. They conducted a meticulous, 6-hour autopsy, taking tissue and blood samples for extensive toxicological analysis. They were searching for any substance, pesticides, industrial solvents, poisons, or even chemical warfare agents, that could explain the bizarre events in the ER. The initial results of the autopsy only deepened the mystery. They found a host of drugs in her system, consistent with her cancer treatment, but none at toxic levels. They found no traces of common poisons. Her body contained high levels of Tylenol and codeine, but not enough to be fatal. The cause of death was officially listed as cardiac dysrhythmia leading to heart failure, a direct result of kidney failure caused by her metastatic cervical cancer. The autopsy explained why she died, but it offered absolutely no explanation for what happened to the ER staff. The case of the toxic lady, as the press had dubbed her, became a national sensation. It was a story that seemed to defy rational explanation, a real-life medical thriller that had scientists and doctors completely stumped. Was it a case of mass hysteria, where the power of suggestion caused the staff to experience psychosomatic symptoms? This was an early theory, favored by some officials who were eager to close the case. But it couldn't account for the severe, objective medical problems suffered by Dr. Gorchinsky, such as the bone necrosis. This was not something that could be faked or induced by panic. A real physical agent had been at work. The question was, what was it? The answer, when it finally came from a team of forensic scientists at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, would be a theoretical chemical chain reaction so strange and so specific that it seemed almost as unbelievable as the event itself. The official autopsy of Gloria Ramirez had provided a cause of death, but had failed to solve the central, terrifying riddle of the case. What was the source of the mysterious toxic fumes that had sickened an entire emergency room staff? The investigation was at a standstill, caught between the undeniable physical evidence of the staff's illnesses and the complete lack of any identifiable toxin in Ramirez's body. The Riverside Coroner's Office, under immense public and scientific pressure, decided to seek outside help. They sent the tissue and fluid samples to one of the most advanced analytical chemistry facilities in the world, the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in Northern California. It was here that a team of forensic scientists, using cutting-edge technology, would develop a hypothesis that was as elegant as it was bizarre, a chemical explanation that attempted to connect all the strange dots of that chaotic February night. The Livermore team, led by Dr. Patrick M. Grant, began by re-examining all the data. They focused on the strange observations made by the ER staff. The oily sheen on Ramirez's skin, the ammonia-like smell from her blood, and the mysterious manila-colored crystals floating in the syringe. They knew that these were not symptoms of mass hysteria. They were clues to a real chemical process. After weeks of analysis, they pieced together a theoretical chemical chain reaction that, while never definitively proven, remains the most widely accepted scientific explanation for the toxic lady phenomenon. The theory hinges on a common, over-the-counter substance, dimethyl sulfoxide, or DMSO. DMSO is a powerful solvent that was, at the time, being used both as a legitimate industrial degreaser and, more relevantly, as a popular but unproven alternative medicine. It was often sold in gel form at hardware stores and was used by some as a topical home remedy for pain relief, particularly for arthritis. The Livermore scientists hypothesized that Gloria Ramirez, who was suffering from the intense pain of advanced cervical cancer, may have been using DMSO gel on her skin to try and alleviate her suffering. This would explain the oily, garlic-like sheen on her body that the paramedics and ER staff had noticed, a known side effect of topical DMSO use. The presence of DMSO itself was not the problem. The theory proposed that a series of events transformed this benign substance into a highly toxic chemical warfare agent inside her body. The first step in this chain reaction involved the oxygen administered by the paramedics. As they gave her oxygen to assist her shallow breathing, the Livermore team theorized that the excess oxygen combined with the DMSO already in her system, converting it into dimethylsulfone, DMSO2. Dimethylsulfone is a relatively stable, crystalline substance that is solid at room temperature. This, the scientists argued, could account for the mysterious manila-colored crystals that the ER resident had seen floating in Ramirez's blood. The formation of these crystals was a critical clue that pointed to the presence of DMSO2. The final and most crucial step in this deadly chemical cascade occurred in the ER. When the nurse drew Ramirez's blood into a syringe, the sudden drop in pressure and temperature inside the blood tube could have triggered the final chemical conversion. The theory posits that the multiple electric shocks from the defibrillator provided the energy needed to convert the dimethylsulfone, DMSO2, into a far more volatile and toxic compound. Dimethyl sulfate, DMSO4. Dimethyl sulfate is a potent and highly poisonous chemical. It is a powerful alkylating agent, meaning it can damage cells by adding an alkyl group to their DNA, and its vapor is extremely hazardous. Exposure to dimethyl sulfate vapor can cause symptoms that are remarkably consistent with those experienced by the ER staff: convulsions, delirium, paralysis, coma, and severe damage to the kidneys, liver, and heart. The chemical is so dangerous that it has been studied for use as a chemical warfare agent. The theory suggests that as the blood was drawn, this toxic gas vaporized out of the syringe, creating a plume of invisible poison in the tightly confined space of the trauma room. The staff members who were closest to the blood draw, the nurse who held the syringe, the doctor who examined it, the respiratory therapist who was leaning over the patient, would have inhaled the highest concentrations, explaining why they fell ill so quickly and so severely. The ammonia-like smell could have been a byproduct of other metabolic processes occurring in her failing body, a secondary clue that was part of the overall chemical chaos. This hypothesis, which became known as the DMSO theory, was scientifically plausible and elegantly connected all of the strange observations from that night. It explained the oily skin, the crystals in the blood, the ammonia smell, and the specific symptoms of the ER staff. However, it was and remains a theory. It has never been definitively proven. A key piece of evidence was missing. The original syringe of blood containing the crystals had been mistakenly discarded in the chaos of the ER evacuation, so it could never be retested. Furthermore, while the theory is chemically sound in a laboratory setting, there is no other documented medical case of such a chain reaction occurring inside a human body. It would have required a perfect storm of conditions: a massive dose of DMSO, a specific metabolic state caused by her kidney failure, the administration of oxygen, and the electric shocks from the defibrillator. The publication of the Livermore findings brought a sense of scientific closure to many, but it did not satisfy everyone, least of all Gloria Ramirez's family. They were deeply unhappy with the toxic lady moniker that the media had given her, and they rejected the DMSO theory entirely. They insisted that Gloria had never used DMSO. They believed the official explanation was a cover-up, a convenient way for the hospital and the county to avoid liability. Their own investigators proposed a different theory, that the hospital itself was the source of the contamination. They suggested that there had been a leak of toxic sewer gases, such as methylamine, into the ER from faulty pipes, and that Ramirez's death was an unfortunate coincidence that occurred at the same time. They filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the county, but their theory was never substantiated by evidence. The county maintained that the hospital was clean and that the toxic event originated solely with the patient. Other theories have persisted over the years, each attempting to explain the unexplainable. The theory of mass hysteria has never been fully discounted by some skeptics. They argue that the initial genuine symptoms of one or two staff members, perhaps caused by a small chemical exposure or even just the immense stress of the situation, triggered a chain reaction of psychosomatic illness among the rest of the staff. The strange smells and observations, they claim, could have been misinterpretations made in a high-stress environment. However, this theory struggles to account for the objective, long-term, and severe medical conditions like avascular necrosis that Dr. Gorczynski developed. Panic cannot cause bone tissue to die. The case of Gloria Ramirez remains a profound and deeply unsettling medical mystery. It is a story with two distinct tragedies at its core. The first is the tragic death of a young mother from a terrible disease. The second is the bizarre, terrifying, and unexplained event that her death triggered, an event that sickened the very people who were trying to save her. Was she the victim of a 1 in a billion chemical reaction, a perfect storm of circumstances that turned a home remedy into a chemical weapon? Was it a case of a hospital infrastructure failure, a leak of toxic gas that the county refused to acknowledge? Or was it something else entirely, a phenomenon so strange that our current understanding of chemistry and medicine cannot yet explain it? The file on Gloria Ramirez is officially closed, but the questions linger. Her case has become a modern medical legend, a cautionary tale taught to medical students and hazmat teams. It serves as a stark reminder that even in the controlled, scientific world of a modern hospital, the human body can still hold profound and sometimes dangerous mysteries. The term toxic lady has stuck, a sensationalist nickname that unfortunately overshadows the memory of the woman at the center of it all. Gloria Ramirez was not a monster or a scientific curiosity. She was a patient in need of help, but on that one February night, for reasons that we may never fully understand, her body became a vessel for a mysterious and dangerous force that turned a place of healing into a scene of unexplained chaos. The Springfield 3, the tragic and bizarre case of Gloria Ramirez, is a mystery that unfolded within the sterile, contained world of a hospital, a scientific puzzle that defied easy explanation. But some mysteries are not contained at all. They begin in the most familiar and cherished of places, a home on a quiet street, and then expand outwards, becoming a void that swallows 3 lives at once and leaves a community questioning its own sense of safety. This is a story about the end of a celebration, a night of youthful promise that dissolved into one of America's most baffling and haunting unsolved cases. This is the story of the Springfield 3. Springfield, Missouri, in the early summer of 1992, was a picture of American heartland life. Known as the Queen City of the Ozarks, it was a thriving but comfortable city, a place where the pace was a little slower, the community was strong, and the streets felt safe. It was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and didn't always feel the need to lock their doors. It was a city on the cusp of summer, and for the senior class of Kickapoo High School, it was a time of immense celebration and boundless optimism. On June 6, 1992, they had graduated. Their lives were stretching out before them, full of promise and possibility. For 2 of those seniors, Susie Streeter and Stacy McCall, that night of celebration would be their last. Susie Streeter was an energetic and popular 19-year-old, known for her artistic flair and vibrant personality. Her mother, Cheryl Levitt, was a 47-year-old cosmetologist, a hardworking single mom who was deeply devoted to her daughter. They lived together in a neat, modest home at 1717 East Delmar Street, a quiet, tree-lined road in a respectable part of town. Stacy McCall, 18, was Susie's best friend. She was bright, dependable, and excited about her future plans to attend college. The 2 girls were inseparable, and on the night of their high school graduation, they planned to celebrate with friends. The evening of June 6th was a blur of parties and goodbyes, a classic rite of passage for new graduates. Susie and Stacy attended several gatherings, hopping from one friend's house to another, soaking in the final moments of their high school lives. Their last confirmed stop was a party in the nearby town of Battlefield. Friends who were with them said they were in high spirits, laughing and making plans for the summer. They decided to leave the party around 2 a.m. on the morning of June 7th. They had originally planned to spend the night at another friend's house, but that friend's house was too crowded, so they decided to head back to Susie's house on Delmar Street instead. This was the last time any of their friends would see them. The next morning, The sun rose on what was supposed to be the first day of a fun-filled summer. Susie and Stacy had made plans with other friends to spend the day at Whitewater, a popular local water park. When they failed to show up and didn't answer their phones, their friends started to get concerned. Stacy's mother, Janice McCall, also began to worry. It was unlike her responsible daughter not to call and check in. Throughout the day, Janice and Stacy's friends made repeated calls to the Levitt house, but the phone just rang and rang, unanswered. By late afternoon, concern had turned to genuine alarm. Janice McCall and her husband, Stu, decided to drive over to the house on Delmar Street to check on the girls. When they arrived, they found a scene that was not one of chaos or violence, but one of profound and unsettling stillness. The first oddity was the front porch light. The glass globe that covered the bulb was shattered, with shards of broken glass scattered on the porch. It was strange, but Janice initially dismissed it, thinking perhaps the girls had broken it accidentally while coming in late. She knocked on the front door. There was no answer. Finding the door unlocked, she cautiously pushed it open and stepped inside, calling out the girls' names. The house was quiet. The television in the living room was on, its screen showing the snowy static of a channel that had gone off the air for the night. The family dog, a small Yorkshire Terrier named Cinnamon, was inside and seemed agitated and excited to see them, but was otherwise unharmed. As Janice walked through the house, the scene grew more and more perplexing. In the living room, neatly lined up on the floor, were the girls' purses. Susie's purse and Stacy's purse were there, containing their wallets, cash, and car keys. Cheryl Levitt's purse was also there. This was a critical and deeply disturbing detail. A woman does not leave the house without her purse. The presence of all three purses immediately suggested that wherever the women had gone, they had not planned to be gone for long, and they had likely left the house in a hurry. All three of their cars, Cheryl's, Susie's, and Stacy's, were parked outside. Janice went into Cheryl's bedroom. The bed looked like it had been slept in. A book Cheryl had been reading was on the nightstand, lying face down as if she had just set it there. Her cigarettes and lighter were also on the nightstand, items her family said she never would have left behind. She checked Susie's room in the basement. Her bed, too, appeared to have been slept in. It seemed that Cheryl and Susie had come home, gone to bed, and then, at some point in the night or early morning, had vanished. The makeup Susie had worn to her graduation parties had been partially removed and was laid out on her nightstand, suggesting she had started her nighttime routine before being interrupted. It was in this state of confusion and rising panic that Janice McCall made a tragic and inadvertent mistake that would haunt the investigation forever. While she was in the house, the phone rang. She answered it, hoping it might be Stacy or Susie. On the other end of the line was a man's voice, making a series of what she later described as lewd and disgusting comments. She immediately hung up in disgust. A few moments later, a friend of Stacy's called. While on the phone, Janice noticed the blinking light of the answering machine. Hoping it might contain a message from the girls, she went to play it back. She listened to the lewd message from the strange man again, and in her frustration and haste to erase it, she accidentally hit the button that deleted all the messages on the tape, including the strange one and any others that may have been there before it. Police would later theorize that she may have erased the only clue the kidnapper ever left behind. Realizing something was terribly wrong, Janice called the police. When the first officers arrived, they were met with a scene that defied easy explanation. There were no obvious signs of a struggle inside the house. There was no blood, no overturned furniture, no indication of a violent confrontation. Everything, aside from the shattered porch light, was unnervingly neat. Because the scene did not look like a typical crime scene, the initial police response was not as urgent as it could have been. They didn't immediately seal off the house, and in the hours between the discovery and the arrival of detectives, at least 20 friends and family members walked through the home, searching for clues, touching surfaces, and unintentionally contaminating what would soon be declared the most important crime scene in Springfield's history. By the next day, the case of the Springfield Three had exploded into a massive investigation and a national media sensation. The idea that three women, two of them teenage girls on the night of their graduation, could vanish from a locked house in a safe, quiet neighborhood was a story that tapped into the deepest fears of suburban America. The search was immense, involving hundreds of volunteers, police dogs, and searches of nearby lakes, rivers, and remote wooded areas. The faces of Cheryl, Susie, and Stacy were plastered on posters and broadcast on news reports across the country. Investigators were faced with a confounding mystery. The scene suggested two primary possibilities. The first was that the women had been abducted by a stranger, or strangers, who had somehow forced their way into the house. The broken porch light could have been the result of a struggle at the front door. But if that were the case, why was there no sign of a fight inside? How could an intruder subdue three women without creating a significant disturbance? The second possibility was that the women had left willingly with someone they knew. Perhaps a friend or an acquaintance had knocked on the door in the middle of the night, and they had left with this person, not expecting any harm. This would explain the lack of forced entry and the neatness of the house. But who could this person be? And what could have happened to them after they left? The case was a vacuum of hard evidence. With a contaminated crime scene and no clear leads, the investigation turned to the lives of the three women, searching for any hint of trouble, any secret enemies, or any personal connections that could explain their disappearance. They were delving into the shadows of three ordinary lives, hoping to find an extraordinary answer. But the deeper they looked, the more the mystery seemed to darken, leading them down a path filled with rumors, potential suspects, and tantalizing but unproven leads that would stretch on for decades, leaving a family and a community trapped in an agonizing state of limbo. The investigation into the disappearance of Cheryl Levitt, Susie Streeter, and Stacy McCall quickly became the most intensive and frustrating case in the history of the Springfield Police Department. They were faced with a confounding paradox: a crime scene that was both pristine and hopelessly contaminated, the lack of any forensic evidence inside the house. No blood, no foreign DNA, no fingerprints from an intruder, left them with nothing tangible to pursue. The 20 or so well-meaning friends and family members who had walked through the house in the initial hours had inadvertently created a fog of trace evidence that made it impossible to isolate anything belonging to a potential suspect. With the physical investigation at a dead end, the task force was forced to build its case from the outside in, focusing on the lives of the three missing women and a handful of strange peripheral clues. One of the first and most enduring points of interest was the shattered porch light. While it could have been an accident, detectives leaned towards the theory that it was intentional. It could have been a way for an abductor to ensure their approach to the house was shrouded in darkness. Or, more chillingly, it could have been a deliberate act of cleaning up. If there had been a struggle on the porch and the attacker had been cut on the broken glass, they might have taken the shards with them to remove any trace of their own blood or DNA. Investigators noted that the glass had been swept up into a small pile, though the broom itself was left on the porch. This suggested a hurried, incomplete attempt at cleaning the scene. The other major clue was the lewd and unidentified phone call that Stacy's mother, Janice, had accidentally erased from the answering machine. This became a source of immense speculation and regret. Was the caller a simple prankster, a random crank taking advantage of a tragic situation? Or was he the abductor, taunting the family or attempting to lay a false trail? The lost message was a ghost that would haunt the investigation forever, a piece of audio that might have held the key to the entire mystery. With little else to go on, investigators delved into the personal lives of Cheryl, Susie, and Stacy, searching for anyone who might have had a motive to harm them. They were all described as well-liked, with no known enemies. Stacy, in particular, was seen as a model student and daughter. The focus inevitably turned to Susie and her mother, Cheryl, and their circle of acquaintances. Susie was known to have a more rebellious streak and had friends who occasionally dabbled in drugs. Cheryl had gone through a recent divorce. Investigators explored every angle, from jilted ex-boyfriends to potential drug-related disputes, but every lead seemed to fizzle out into rumor and speculation. A few persons of interest emerged over the years, but no one was ever charged in connection with the crime. One was an acquaintance of Susie's who had a history of violence and was known to have been at some of the same graduation parties that night. Another was a transient who had been in the area at the time. Both men were questioned extensively, but police could never find enough evidence to link them directly to the disappearances. The case remained stubbornly cold for years, kept alive only by the tireless efforts of the McCall and Levitt families and the occasional sensationalist media report. Then, in the late 1990s, a new and compelling suspect emerged from the shadows of another crime. His name was Robert Craig Cox, a convicted kidnapper and robber who was serving time in a Texas prison. Cox, who had been living in Springfield at the time of the disappearances, told journalists that he knew what had happened to the three women. He claimed that he had seen them leave a party with a group of people and that they were later murdered and buried in a location he refused to disclose unless he was granted immunity from prosecution. He claimed he was not the killer but was present when the murders occurred. Cox's story was tantalizing. He provided details that seemed plausible, and his own violent criminal history made him a credible suspect. The Springfield police took his claims seriously and traveled to Texas to interview him. However, his story was inconsistent and changed with each retelling. He seemed to be playing a cat-and-mouse game with investigators, reveling in the attention. He failed a polygraph test regarding the case. He led them to believe the bodies were buried near the foundation of the south parking garage at Cox Hospital in Springfield, but a ground-penetrating radar survey of the area found no evidence of a burial. Most critically, his alibi for the morning of June 7, 1992, placed him at church with his girlfriend, an alibi she confirmed. While many investigators still believe Cox knows more than he is telling, they have never been able to build a solid case against him. He remains a primary person of interest, a taunting figure who dangles the promise of a resolution that he may or may not possess. As the decades passed with no arrests, the case became a magnet for psychics, tipsters, and conspiracy theories. One of the most persistent and disturbing rumors centers on a theory that the women were abducted, murdered, and their bodies disposed of by being cremated at a local funeral home. This would explain the complete lack of physical remains. Another theory involves a strange report from a woman who claimed to have seen a van pull over on a highway near Springfield on the morning of June 7th. She said she saw a woman who looked like Susie driving the van, and a man's voice from the back of the van shouting, "Don't do anything stupid." The sighting, like so many others, was never verified. One of the most concrete and unsettling leads emerged just a few years ago. In 2019, a local news station, KY3, unearthed a long-forgotten piece of evidence. A separate police report from the same night of the disappearances, just hours before the women were believed to have been abducted. Another woman reported that a man driving a green van had been stalking her in the same area. He had followed her for several blocks, making her so fearful that she ran a red light to escape. This report, filed just before the Springfield 3 vanished, raises the chilling possibility that a predator was actively hunting in that neighborhood that night. The green van has become another phantom in a case full of them. The families of the three women have lived in a state of agonizing limbo for over 30 years. Cheryl's mother, Letty, passed away without ever knowing what happened to her daughter and granddaughter. Susie's father also passed away. Stacy's parents, Janice and Stu McCall, became fierce and dedicated advocates, working tirelessly to keep their daughter's case in the public eye. They founded a nonprofit organization to help other families of missing persons and have spent their life savings searching for answers. Their resilience in the face of such an unimaginable and unending tragedy is a testament to the power of a parent's love. The house on East Delmar Street became an infamous landmark in Springfield. For years, it stood empty, a silent monument to the mystery that had occurred within its walls. The porch light was never repaired. The house was eventually purchased by a local journalist who was fascinated by the case. He has preserved it, a time capsule from that night in June 1992. The case of the Springfield 3 is a story that defies all attempts at a neat resolution. It is a crime that seems both impossibly complex and terrifyingly simple. It happened in the heart of a safe community, to three ordinary women, and left behind an almost perfect void of evidence. Were they the victims of a chance encounter with a violent predator who was stalking their neighborhood? Were they abducted by someone they knew, a friend or acquaintance who harbored a dark secret? Or was it something else entirely? A connection to a darker world that has remained hidden all these years? The disappearance of Cheryl Levitt, Susie Streeter, and Stacy McCall is a chilling reminder of the fragility of safety and the terrifying reality that sometimes people can simply be erased from their own lives without a trace. The mystery is not just about finding a killer. It's about the profound horror of the unknown. The front door of the house on Delmar Street was left unlocked, an unwitting invitation into a mystery that has endured for a generation. The TV was left on, casting a snowy, static light on an empty room, a perfect metaphor for a case that has offered no clear picture, only endless, agonizing noise. The disappearance of Dorothy Furstein, the case of the Springfield 3, is a terrifying example of a sanctuary violated, a home turned into a crime scene defined by absence. But what happens when the violation isn't a single violent act, but a slow, creeping campaign of terror that culminates in a vanishing? This is a story that begins not with a sudden disappearance, but with a prelude of fear, a series of strange and threatening events that built up over years until a mother was plucked from the heart of her home, leaving behind a bewildered child and a mystery that has remained frozen in time for over 70 years. This is the deeply strange and haunting case of Dorothy Dottie Furstein. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in the 1940s was a city of industry and neighborhoods. Life for many revolved around family, work, and the tight-knit communities of their local parish. In this world lived Dorothy Furstein, a 38-year-old wife and mother. She was married to Jules Furstein, a prominent local magistrate, and they had 2 children. By all outward appearances, they were a successful upper-middle-class family living a comfortable life. But beneath the surface, a current of profound fear had begun to run through Dorothy's life. The story of her disappearance truly begins 5 years earlier, in 1944. On a cold January night, Dorothy was at home with her children when she was the victim of a brutal and bizarre assault. An unknown man broke into her home, confronted her, and beat her unconscious, leaving her with a broken nose, a broken jaw, and a severe concussion. When she regained consciousness, she was dazed and terrified. The attacker had not stolen anything of value, and he had not sexually assaulted her. The motive seemed to be nothing more than pure, unadulterated violence. The incident was terrifying, but it was seen as an isolated, albeit brutal, home invasion. Police investigated, but no suspect was ever identified. The event left Dorothy deeply shaken, a seed of fear planted in what should have been her safest space. For 5 years, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. The trauma of the attack faded, but it never fully disappeared. Then, on the evening of October 18, 1949, just 11 days after Jean Spangler vanished on the opposite side of the country, the terror returned. Dorothy was at home with her 9-year-old daughter, Marcy, and her infant son, Edward. Her husband, Jules, was out for the evening. Around 9 p.m., the family's live-in maid had gone to the movies, leaving Dorothy alone with the children. A little while later, Marcy was in her bedroom when she heard a strange noise. She walked out into the hallway and saw a man she didn't recognize coming down the stairs from the 3rd floor of their large home. The man was middle-aged, dressed in brown work clothes, and had a strange, pockmarked face. Marcy, a child, was not immediately alarmed. The man smiled at her, gently patted her on the head, and said, "Go back to sleep, little one. Your mother went to the store to get some food." He then calmly walked out the front door and disappeared into the night. Confused but not frightened by the man's calm demeanor, Marcy went back to her room. A short time later, she heard the family dog barking frantically downstairs. She went to investigate and found her baby brother, Edward, crying in his crib on the 1st floor. Of her mother, Dorothy, there was no sign. The living room was in slight disarray, but there were no overt signs of a violent struggle. Dorothy Furstein was simply gone. When Jules Furstein returned home around 11:15 p.m., he was met by his crying children and a scene of quiet confusion. He immediately knew something was terribly wrong. He searched the house, calling his wife's name, but there was no answer. He found her purse, her keys, and her money still in the house. The coat she would have worn out into the chilly October night was still in the closet. It was clear that wherever she had gone, She had not gone willingly and had not planned to leave. He called the police. The investigation began immediately, and the police were faced with a chilling and perplexing scenario. This was not a random home invasion. It felt targeted and strangely personal. The man Marcy had seen was the central clue. Who was this calm, pockmarked man who could enter a home, seemingly abduct a woman, and then have the presence of mind to comfort her child with a gentle lie before casually walking out the front door? The description was broadcast and a massive search was launched, but the man was a ghost. Investigators immediately looked at the 1944 assault, believing the two events had to be connected. Was this the same man, returning 5 years later to finish a job? The brutality of the first attack suggested a deep personal animosity. Police began to dig into Dorothy and Jules Forstein's lives, searching for anyone who might hold such a profound grudge. The focus naturally fell on Jules Forstein. As a city magistrate, he dealt with criminals and unsavory characters on a daily basis. It was entirely possible that one of the many people he had sentenced to prison had sought revenge by targeting his wife. This was a strong and logical theory. Jules provided police with a list of individuals he had prosecuted who he felt were capable of such a vengeful act. The police investigated these leads, but one by one, they were ruled out. The men were either still in prison, had moved away, or had verifiable alibis. The investigation then turned to a more intimate and uncomfortable possibility: Jules himself. In any case of a missing wife, the husband is always the first person police look at. Jules Forstein's behavior on the night of the disappearance raised some questions. He had been out of the house, giving him a potential alibi, but his whereabouts were not entirely clear. Furthermore, rumors began to circulate that the Forsteins' marriage was not as happy as it appeared, that Jules was having an affair. Could he have hired someone to first intimidate and then ultimately remove his wife? The idea of a prominent city magistrate orchestrating such a crime was shocking, but not impossible. However, the police could find no concrete evidence to support this theory. There was no financial trail, no suspicious contacts, nothing to link Jules directly to the crime. He publicly maintained his innocence and appeared to be a genuinely devastated husband, pleading for his wife's safe return. As the days turned into weeks, the case grew colder. No ransom demand was ever made, which seemed to rule out a kidnapping for financial gain. The complete lack of a body or any further communication left the family and the police in a state of agonizing limbo. The only witness was a 9-year-old child whose memory of the man's face, seen briefly in a dimly lit hallway, was the single, fragile key to the entire mystery. The case of Dorothy Forstein is a chilling study in calculated cruelty. Unlike a sudden, violent abduction, this was a crime that seemed to unfold in slow motion, beginning years earlier with a brutal warning shot. The kidnapper's calm demeanor, his gentle pat on the head of a child whose mother he had just taken, is one of the most unsettling details in the annals of true crime. It speaks to a level of cold-blooded confidence and psychological control that is truly terrifying. He was not a panicked intruder. He was a man on a mission whose purpose remains a complete and utter mystery. What was the source of this deep-seated vendetta? Was it a result of Jules Forstein's work? A secret from Dorothy's own past? Or was it something else entirely? A motive so private and so well hidden that it has remained buried for over 7 decades, leaving behind only the ghost of a pockmarked man and the unanswered question of what happened to Dorothy Forstein after she went to the store. The investigation into the disappearance of Dorothy Forstein was a frustrating journey into a world of shadows and whispers. With no ransom note, no body, and no forensic evidence, the police were left with only the conflicting stories and potential motives of the people in Dorothy's life. The two primary theories, that she was the victim of a revenge plot against her magistrate husband, or that her husband himself was somehow involved, were meticulously explored, but both paths led to frustrating dead ends. The trail of vengeful criminals prosecuted by Jules Forstein grew cold, and the case against Jules himself remained purely speculative, built on rumor rather than evidence. As the weeks dragged on, the police continued to dig deeper into Dorothy's personal life, hoping to uncover a secret that could explain her abduction. They learned that in the years following the brutal 1944 assault, Dorothy had become a different person. The attack had left her with more than just physical scars. It had instilled in her a deep and persistent sense of fear. She had become what her friends described as a nervous wreck, prone to anxiety and rarely leaving the house alone. This psychological profile seemed to make her an unlikely candidate for someone who would willingly leave with a stranger or run away to start a new life. She was a woman living in fear, and it appeared that her greatest fear had finally come true. The investigation took a strange turn when a local man named Morris Annenberg came forward with a peculiar story. Annenberg was a private detective who claimed that Dorothy Furstein had hired him just a few weeks before she vanished. According to him, she believed her husband, Jules, was having an affair and had hired Annenberg to follow him and gather evidence for a potential divorce. This claim, if true, was a bombshell. It provided a powerful motive for Jules Furstein to want his wife out of the picture. A messy, public divorce, instigated by his own wife and fueled by evidence of his infidelity, could have ruined his career as a respected city magistrate. The police took Annenberg's claim very seriously. However, when they pressed him for proof, notes, contracts, or any documentation of his employment by Dorothy, he could provide none. Jules Furstein, for his part, vehemently denied the claim, stating that his wife had never hired a private investigator and that his marriage was sound. The detective's story remained an unverified, he said. She said, a tantalizing but ultimately unprovable piece of the puzzle that cast a permanent shadow of suspicion over Jules. The case grew even more bizarre with the emergence of a man named Joseph Shorty Meter. Meter was a small-time criminal and handyman who had done some work at the Furstein residence. What made him a person of interest was his uncanny resemblance to the police sketch that had been created based on 9-year-old Marcy Forstein's description of the pockmarked man. Meter had a similar build, and his face was scarred from a childhood bout of smallpox. He was brought in for questioning and placed in a lineup. When Marcy was brought in to identify him, she studied the line of men carefully. She did not definitively identify Meter as the man she saw in her hallway, but she did state that he looked the most like him. It was not a positive identification, but it was enough to make Meter the primary suspect. Police subjected Meter to intense interrogation. He had a criminal record and seemed to fit the profile of a hired thug. However, he had a solid alibi for the night of the abduction. Multiple witnesses confirmed that he had been working at a gas station miles away at the time Dorothy disappeared. Despite the strong physical resemblance, the alibi was unbreakable, and police were forced to release him. The question lingered. Was it a case of extraordinary coincidence, or was Meter's alibi somehow fabricated? The trail to the pockmarked man had once again gone cold. With no new leads, the case languished. For years, Jules Furstein continued to publicly plead for information about his wife, offering a reward for her safe return. He raised his 2 children, who grew up without ever knowing what happened to their mother. The disappearance became a piece of Philadelphia folklore, a chilling local legend about the magistrate's wife who vanished into thin air. Years later, long after the case had faded from the headlines, a deathbed confession seemed to offer a final, grim resolution. A man named Thomas Three-Fingered Tommy Cimino, a known mob enforcer on his deathbed, allegedly confessed to a cellmate that he had been hired to get rid of Dorothy Furstein. According to the cellmate's account, Cimino claimed that Jules Furstein had paid him and another man to abduct and murder his wife. He said they had buried her body in a desolate, sandy area near the New Jersey shore. This confession seemed to tie all the loose ends together. It confirmed Jules's involvement, explained the professional nature of the abduction, and provided a location for the body. Police, acting on this information, conducted searches in the area Cimino described, but after more than a decade, the landscape had changed and extensive searches yielded nothing. The confession, being secondhand and from an unreliable source, was not enough to bring charges against the now elderly Jules Furstein. It was another tantalizing but unprovable conclusion. Jules Furstein died in 1993, maintaining his innocence to the very end. He never remarried. The fate of Dorothy Furstein remains one of Philadelphia's most enduring unsolved mysteries. The case is a labyrinth of compelling but contradictory possibilities. Was she the victim of a random, brutal intruder who returned to finish what he started? Was she targeted by an enemy of her husband, a criminal seeking a terrible and personal form of revenge? Was she murdered by a hired killer on the orders of her own husband, a man desperate to avoid a scandalous divorce? Or was it something else entirely, a secret from her own past that finally caught up with her? Each theory is plausible, yet each lacks the definitive proof needed to close the case. The story is a chilling reminder of how a life can be systematically dismantled, first by fear, and then by a final, violent act of erasure. The image of the calm, pockmarked man, gently patting a child's head before leading her mother away to an unknown fate, is a uniquely terrifying portrait of calculated evil. He was a ghost who walked into a home, took a life, and then vanished back into the shadows, leaving behind a silence that has now lasted for more than 70 years. The case of Dorothy Verstein is a testament to the fact that sometimes the most horrific monsters are not the ones who hide in the dark, but the ones who can look a child in the eye and lie. The Murders at Burger Chef. The case of Dorothy Verstein is a chilling story of a targeted disappearance, a crime that seemed to be the final act in a long, personal vendetta. But what happens when the motive is not personal at all? What happens when a crime is so senseless, so random, and so devoid of a clear reason that it seems to defy human logic itself? This is a story about the end of a shift, a routine closing of a fast food restaurant that descended into a nightmare of abduction and murder, leaving a town in fear and investigators with a puzzle that has remained unsolved for over 4 decades. This is the story of the Speedway Burger Chef murders. Speedway, Indiana, a suburb just west of Indianapolis, is a town synonymous with speed and American ambition. It's the home of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, a place of thunderous engines and cheering crowds. But on the night of Friday, November 17, 1978, the town would become known for a very different reason, a crime that was slow, brutal, and agonizingly quiet. The Burger Chef restaurant on Crawfordsville Road was a typical fast food joint of its era. It was a familiar and popular spot for families, teenagers, and workers from the nearby industrial plants. It was a place of simple, everyday routines. On that Friday night, for young employees were working the closing shift. The manager was 20-year-old Jane Freet. She was known as a dedicated and responsible leader, well-liked by her crew. Working with her were 3 teenage employees: 17-year-old Ruth Shelton, 16-year-old Daniel Davis, and 16-year-old Mark Flemons. They were a typical crew of high school kids, working a part-time job to earn some extra money, looking forward to the end of their shift and the start of their weekend. It was a busy night, the start of the weekend rush. But by 11 p.m., the restaurant had closed to the public, and the crew began the familiar, mundane tasks of cleaning up. Around midnight, another Burger Chef employee, who was not working that night, stopped by the restaurant to visit his friends. He looked through the glass door and saw the 4 of them inside, sweeping floors and wiping down counters. Everything appeared to be completely normal. He didn't want to interrupt their work, so he left without going in. This would be the last time anyone, other than their killers, would ever see the 4 employees alive. The next morning, Saturday, the opening manager arrived at the restaurant around 5:30 a.m. to prepare for the day. He was immediately struck by a sense of profound wrongness. The back door of the restaurant was unlocked and slightly ajar. Stepping inside, he found the restaurant eerily empty. The lights were still on. The cash register drawers were open and empty. On the floor of the manager's office lay 2 empty bank bags, which should have contained the previous night's earnings of approximately $581, about $2,700 in today's money. In the back room, he found the purses belonging to Jane Freet and Ruth Shelton, left behind on a counter. It was clear that a robbery had occurred. But where was the night crew? The manager called the police, who arrived to find a scene that was both a clear crime scene and a frustrating puzzle. The robbery seemed straightforward enough, but the absence of the 4 employees was deeply alarming. There were no signs of a major struggle, no blood, no overt violence. It was as if the crew had been in the middle of their closing duties when they were interrupted, robbed, and then simply vanished. The initial police theory was that this might be a case of employee theft, that the 4 young people had staged the robbery and fled with the cash. But this theory quickly fell apart. The amount of money taken was relatively small, hardly enough to motivate four people to abandon their lives, their families, and their belongings. The presence of the purses, in particular, was a troubling detail. Young women do not willingly leave without their purses. The investigation quickly shifted from a robbery to a kidnapping case. A massive search was launched. The families of the four missing employees were plunged into a state of agonizing uncertainty. They knew their children. These were not runaways or thieves. These were good kids who had been targeted in a violent crime. As police began to process the scene at the Burger Chef, they made a critical discovery that pointed to the terrifying possibility of an inside job, or at least a crime committed by someone familiar with the restaurant's operations. The safe, which should have contained more money, had not been opened. But more importantly, the power to the restaurant had not been cut, and the alarm had not been triggered in a way that would alert the police. The robbery seemed to have been executed with a certain level of knowledge. The case remained a baffling missing persons investigation for 2 long days. Then, on Sunday afternoon, the mystery took a devastating and tragic turn. A couple out for a walk in a rural, wooded area of Johnson County, more than 20 miles south of the Burger Chef, stumbled upon a horrific scene. There, scattered among the trees, were the bodies of the 4 missing employees. The crime scene was brutal and complex. Jane Freet and Daniel Davis had been killed by execution-style gunshots to the back of the head, both shot with a .38 caliber firearm. Ruth Shelton had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and abdomen with a knife that had a blade at least 4 inches long. The cause of Mark Flemon's death was the most confusing. It appeared he had been bludgeoned, possibly with a chain or a similar object, and had ultimately died from asphyxiation, choking on his own blood. The sheer variety of weapons and methods of murder was perplexing. It suggested that there was more than one killer, and that the attack was frenzied and chaotic. The discovery of the bodies transformed the case into a quadruple homicide investigation, one of the most shocking in Indiana's history. The randomness and the brutality of the crime sent a wave of fear through the community. This wasn't a crime of passion or a domestic dispute. It was a robbery that had escalated into a massacre for reasons that no one could comprehend. Why would robbers, after getting the money, go to the trouble of abducting 4 people, driving them 20 miles to a remote location, and then systematically murdering them? The level of violence seemed wildly disproportionate to the small amount of cash that was stolen. Investigators were now faced with a series of critical questions. Who were the killers? How many were there? And what was the motive for the murders? The evidence suggested at least 2 attackers, given the different weapons used. Police began to develop a working theory of the crime. They believed the perpetrators entered the restaurant near closing time, possibly through the unlocked back door, and surprised the crew. They forced them to hand over the money from the registers. Then, for some unknown reason, instead of leaving, they decided to abduct all 4 employees. This was a fateful and puzzling decision. It massively increased their risk of being caught. It suggested that one of the employees may have recognized one of the attackers, forcing the killers to eliminate all the witnesses. This theory that one of the employees knew their killer became a central focus of the investigation. Police began to look closely at the lives and social circles of the 4 victims, searching for any connection, however tenuous, to individuals with a history of violence. The investigation would soon lead them to a group of men from a neighboring town, a group with a reputation for drug dealing and violence, and a potential link to one of the victims that would seem to be the key to unlocking the entire horrific case. But as with so many complex investigations, the path to justice would be anything but straight. The discovery of the 4 murdered employees in the woods of Johnson County plunged the town of Speedway and the entire state of Indiana into a state of shock and mourning. The crime was not just brutal, it was profoundly senseless. The central question that haunted investigators was the why. Why escalate a simple robbery of less than $600 into a quadruple homicide? The most logical and terrifying answer was that at least one of the victims had recognized one of their assailants. This theory became the cornerstone of the investigation, leading police to meticulously comb through the lives of Jane Freet, Ruth Shelton, Daniel Davis, and Mark Flemons, searching for any connection to the violent criminal element that could have targeted them. The investigation soon zeroed in on Daniel Davis. Friends and acquaintances told police that Danny, while a good kid, had a small-time side hustle selling marijuana. This was not uncommon for a teenager in the 1970s, but it opened up a dangerous new avenue for the investigation. Police began to wonder if the robbery had been a drug deal gone wrong, or if Danny owed money to a more serious dealer who decided to make a brutal example of him. This theory suggested that the other three employees were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, innocent bystanders who were eliminated because they were witnesses. This drug-related angle led investigators to a group of men from the neighboring town of Franklin. The Franklin police had been keeping tabs on a local gang known for its involvement in drug trafficking and violent crime. A key witness came forward, a man who claimed that he had seen one of the leaders of this gang, a man with a reputation for extreme violence, harassing Daniel Davis at a party just a few weeks before the murders. The witness claimed the man was angry with Danny over the quality of some marijuana he had purchased. This was a potentially explosive lead. It provided a direct link between one of the victims and a known violent criminal, and it offered a plausible motive for the crime. The investigation into the Franklin gang intensified. Police began to build a circumstantial case against them. They learned that members of the gang were known to carry both a .38 caliber firearm and a knife, matching the weapons used in the murders. Furthermore, a woman who was an acquaintance of the gang leader came forward with a chilling story. She claimed that on the night of the murders, the gang leader had shown up at her house, his clothes covered in blood. He had confessed to her that he and his associates had taken care of some business at the Burger Chef. It was a stunning, albeit second-hand, confession. However, the case against the Franklin gang was plagued by problems. The key witnesses were themselves part of the criminal underworld, and their credibility was questionable. Their stories often changed under pressure, and some later recanted their statements. The police were never able to find the murder weapons or any other piece of physical evidence to tie the gang members directly to the crime scene. Without concrete proof, prosecutors felt they did not have enough to secure a conviction. The Franklin gang theory, while compelling, remained just that, a theory. As the years passed, the case grew cold, but it never faded from the public consciousness. It remained one of Indiana's most infamous and heartbreaking unsolved mysteries. Then, in the mid-1980s, a new and completely different suspect emerged, a man who would confess to the crime in chilling detail. His name was Donald Forrester, a career criminal who was serving time for another offense. While in prison, Forrester contacted investigators and claimed that he was the one who had murdered Ruth Shelton. Forrester's confession was detailed and disturbing. He claimed that the robbery had been orchestrated by a group of men who were trying to scare Jane Freet's brother, who they believed owed them money from a drug deal. Forrester said he was part of the crew that went to the restaurant. He admitted to stabbing Ruth Shelton but claimed he was not involved in the other murders. He even led police to the location where he claimed to have thrown the shell casings from the .38 caliber handgun into a river. Divers searched the location he indicated and, miraculously, found several .38 caliber shell casings. It seemed to be the breakthrough everyone had been waiting for. However, Forrester's confession soon began to fall apart under scrutiny. He was a known jailhouse informant who had a history of providing information, both true and false, in exchange for better treatment or reduced sentences. While the shell casings were found where he said they would be, ballistics tests were inconclusive. They could not be definitively matched to the bullets that killed Jane Freet and Daniel Davis. Furthermore, Forrester recanted his confession, claiming he had only made it up to get a transfer to a different prison and to collect a reward that had been offered for information. He was never charged with the murders. The shell casings remain a tantalizing but frustrating piece of evidence, a potential link that could never be fully forged. The investigation took yet another bizarre twist when police re-examined the initial crime scene photos from the Burger Chef. One detail that had been overlooked for years suddenly became significant. On one of the work tables, someone had left behind a half-smoked cigarette. At the time, it had been dismissed, but investigators now wondered if it could have belonged to one of the killers. Unfortunately, the original cigarette had been lost from evidence years ago, another critical piece of forensic evidence that had slipped through the cracks. The case has been plagued by such missed opportunities and lost evidence. The initial response at the Burger Chef crime scene was criticized for not being thorough enough. The restaurant was cleaned and reopened just 2 days after the employees disappeared, potentially destroying trace evidence before the bodies had even been found. The failure to properly secure and maintain evidence like the cigarette further hampered any future investigation. Over the last 4 decades, the Burger Chef murders have become a fixture of Indiana folklore. The case has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and television shows. Amateur sleuths and internet detectives continue to dissect the evidence, proposing new theories and pointing fingers at different suspects. Some believe the Franklin gang was responsible. Others are convinced it was Donald Forrester. A few even cling to the discredited theory of a rival fast food franchise trying to intimidate the competition. The families of the 4 victims have lived with the agony of not knowing for their entire lives. They have watched as leads have emerged and then evaporated, as suspects have confessed and then recanted. For them, there has been no closure, no justice, only the enduring pain of a loss made infinitely worse by the lack of answers. The Burger Chef murders represent a tear in the fabric of a community, a wound that has never fully healed. It is a story that speaks to the terrifying randomness of violence and the frustrating limitations of the justice system. The crime was a perfect storm of bad luck, missed opportunities, and cunning brutality. The killers, whoever they were, managed to commit a horrific act and then simply melt back into the fabric of society, leaving behind only a trail of broken lives and a mystery that has grown colder and more complex with each passing year. The 4 young people who went to work on that Friday night in 1978 became unwilling symbols of a loss of innocence, their names forever linked to a question that Indiana has never been able to answer. Who killed the Burger Chef for, and why? The investigation into the Burger Chef murders, despite the promising but ultimately frustrating leads involving the Franklin gang and the confession of Donald Forrester, had reached a virtual standstill by the late 1980s. The case file grew thicker with reports, witness statements, and dead-end theories, but the core mystery remained as impenetrable as ever. For the Indiana State Police and the Speedway Police Department, it became the case that would not die, a persistent ghost in their collective conscience. Detectives would retire, passing the voluminous files on to a new generation, each hoping that a fresh set of eyes or a new technological advance might finally crack the case. One of the most significant efforts to revive the investigation came with the advent of DNA technology. In the early 2000s, investigators revisited the small amount of physical evidence that had been preserved. They hoped to find trace amounts of DNA on the victim's clothing, on the discarded bank bags, or on any other item from the scene that could be matched to a suspect. The few testable items were sent to the lab, but the results were disappointing. The evidence was either too degraded after decades in storage or yielded no usable profiles. The scientific breakthrough that had solved so many other cold cases offered no salvation here. The killers had been forensically clean, leaving nothing of themselves behind. The case continued to be fueled by public fascination and the occasional tantalizing tip. One of the most persistent and detailed theories to emerge from public discussion centers on the idea that the robbery was not about money, but was an act of intimidation directed at Jane Freet, the 20-year-old manager. This theory, put forward by independent researchers and discussed at length in online forums, suggests that Jane may have been the primary target. Proponents point to her recent promotion to manager and suggest she may have uncovered employee theft or another illicit activity at the restaurant and was planning to report it. In this scenario, the robbery was a pretext, a way to silence her permanently. The other 3 employees were murdered simply because they were there to witness it. This theory attempts to explain the extreme level of violence, suggesting it was not a random robbery gone wrong, but a calculated, targeted execution. However, like all the other theories, it lacks any concrete evidence to support it. Another avenue that investigators have repeatedly explored is the possibility of a copycat crime. Just 2 weeks after the Burger Chef murders, a robbery occurred at a Ponderosa steakhouse in another part of Indianapolis. The circumstances were eerily similar. The manager was abducted and later found shot to death with a .38 caliber firearm. For a time, police believed the 2 crimes had to be related. However, a man was eventually arrested and convicted for the Ponderosa murder, and he had a solid alibi for the night of the Burger Chef killings. The similarities were deemed to be a tragic coincidence. The psychological toll on the investigators themselves has been profound. Ken York, one of the original Indiana State Police detectives on the case, spent years of his life consumed by the search for the killers. He, like many others, became convinced that the Franklin gang was responsible and was deeply frustrated by the inability to build a prosecutable case. He officially retired with the case still unsolved, but he never truly left it behind, continuing to consult on it and speak to the media in the hopes of shaking a new lead loose. His experience is a testament to how an unsolved case can haunt not only the families of the victims, but also the law enforcement officers who dedicate their lives to finding answers. The town of Speedway itself was forever changed. The Burger Chef restaurant on Crawfordsville Road was torn down years ago, replaced by a different business, but the ground it stood on is still regarded by locals as a place of tragedy. The crime ushered in a new era of caution and fear in a town that had once felt immune to such senseless violence. Parents became more protective, and the sense of community safety was deeply eroded. Today, more than 4 decades after the crime, the Burger Chef murders remain officially unsolved, but not forgotten. The case file is still open. Every few years, a new detective is assigned to it. A new appeal for information is made to the public, and a new wave of media coverage brings the story back to the forefront. The Indiana State Police maintain that they are just one credible witness, one piece of forgotten evidence away from solving the crime. They believe that someone, somewhere, still holds the key. Perhaps it is a former girlfriend or acquaintance of one of the killers, someone who was too afraid to speak in 1978, but whose conscience may have softened with age. Perhaps it is a piece of evidence sitting in someone's attic, a discarded weapon or a souvenir from a crime that has grown heavier with each passing year. The 4 victims, Jane Freet, Ruth Shelton, Daniel Davis, and Mark Flemons, are frozen in time as teenagers and a young adult on the cusp of their lives. They represent a snapshot of youthful promise that was brutally extinguished. Jane was a responsible manager with a bright future. Ruth was a budding poet and artist. Daniel was a quiet boy who loved working on cars. Mark was an aspiring musician. Their deaths were not just a statistic in an unsolved crime file. They were the obliteration of 4 futures and the beginning of a lifetime of grief for their families. The Burger Chef case stands as a monument to the frustrating nature of whodunit investigations where the why is as elusive as the who. It is a complex web of potential motives. A drug deal, a botched robbery, a targeted killing, each plausible, but none provable. It is a story of a flawed investigation, of lost evidence, and of witnesses who were either too scared or too unreliable to provide the linchpin the case needed. Ultimately, the horror of the Burger Chef murders lies in its stark lack of reason. The killers took 4 lives for less than $600, an act of violence so disproportionate and so extreme that it defies comprehension. They then vanished, leaving behind a legacy of fear and a series of questions that have echoed through the decades. The silence from that wooded area in Johnson County has been absolute. The case is a cold, dark void in Indiana's history, a chilling reminder that sometimes the most monstrous acts are committed for reasons we may never be privileged or cursed enough to understand. The shift at the Burger Chef ended long ago, but for the families and the community, the night has never truly been over.